Thank you very much. And a very warm welcome again, everyone, to our old friends and our new friends who are joining us for IRAHSS this year. Those of you who've done IRAHSS before will know that this is actually the fourth time I've been asked to moderate this opening panel. It's kind of a road show, I think, almost, you know. I tried to do a bad job last year. It didn't seem to have worked. But they did give me a co-moderator this year, which is useful. So I'm hoping I can gradually phase myself into irrelevance and be able to sit at the back and heckle one day. But I can't do that this year. This year, Max and I are going to be co-moderating this. We hope it'll be very much a conversation with all of you and everyone in the audience as well, with lots of comments and questions. And Max and I had an idea about how he wanted to start this particular panel off. You see some stuff on the Mentimeter behind us as well, all of your contributions. We will be referring to those later on. But we wanted to start with something where we asked the panelists to do a bit of response on organizational and structural issues. Max, why don't you take us into that theme, given that I know you're quite keen on it.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think it's sort of fortuitous that we have this conference here, because this very city was the site of the collapse of an entire world system in 1942, the fall of Singapore. And that changed everything. And it wasn't just a failure to plan and failure to anticipate. It was failure to adapt. The Japanese attack on Malaya was the ultimate black elephant that everyone knew it was going to happen. Okay, so what do you do about it? Once it happened, once war was declared, why the failure to adapt? Why did General Percival fail to change his strategy, even when he had 6,000 engineers under his command, which begged him on December 8th to fortify the Johor Strait? And he kept saying, oh, no. If you do that, then it will be bad for morale of our forces in Malaya and of the people, the civilians living in Singapore. What about the morale of the whole empire? And sure enough, that's what happened. And sure enough, he said, oh, good Lord, oh, we didn't anticipate we would actually lose. Oh, well. So that, I think, is the question that we need to think about. I do a lot of these conferences. I'm a fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point and at the Atlantic Council. And most of the conferences I go to are about prediction. You know, how do we forecast what the future will look like? And as I think we all know here, what if we're wrong? If we were having this conference here in 1988, all the experts would say, well, we understand that the Soviet Union will always be there. Japan is obviously going to own the world. Apartheid is obviously here to stay. And the United States will always elect a career politician. Well, obviously, the world has completely changed. So to my esteemed panel of experts, here are the questions. Here are the potential black elephants. Here's what could happen. But in this crazy world of instability and insecurity, what do we need to survive and thrive in this world? And when I say what do we need, I mean, what do parents teach their children? What skill set, what mindset are our children going to need? What are systems, be they government or private industry? What are nation states? What are international organizations? We're going to start here and go down. What is necessary to provide answers to these questions? Bam.
No, let's go the other way.
All right.
I just spoke.
Schroeder, go for it.
What the hell with you? Thanks.
Yeah, he just punted.
Aaron could jump in.
That was a terrible punt overall. So there's some things I'm perhaps more able to talk about than others here overall, but in terms of what I think about even with my children that way is something that I touched on when I spoke before, because I think critical thinking is actually one of the best things that we can leave to anyone, because all these remarkable panelists have articulated a world of flux, of flexibility, that if you come at it too strictly about paradigms of history or too strictly about paradigms of how you think the world is constructed, you're just doomed to be wrong, because you have to be able to take that in place. So I think that's one thing that's very important. I will tell you in the world that we're going in that the STEAM skills of science and technology, engineering, art, and math are going to be more and more important than they've ever been before. And that doesn't, I was a history major, it doesn't mean that that takes away from anything, but I think that's very powerful in the way that we look at the world. But the third thing, and the last one I think I'd probably remark, is that I think in a lot of respects that we get bogged down by analogy of history because it's important, but at the same time, we really do think the past is prologue. And to the points that you just made before, it almost never is. And I think the ability to have these discussions not only about what is, but what can happen is a very powerful thing. So I'll give you an example of a mindset of some friends in technology, and it's not one that would necessarily work here, but it's just interesting in and of itself. I was with Larry Page recently, who was talking about one day we'll be able to fly to Japan in 35 minutes. And I looked at him kind of funny, and I said, why? And he didn't skip a beat. He said, there's nothing in the law of physics that says we cannot. And that's just an incredible mindset to think about not what are the limitations that contain us all the time, but how can we think about the world in a different paradigm, a different phrase, when we know the ultimate limitations are no longer restricting us. And I see that almost nowhere in government, but I think there's incredible potential in that going forward.
Well, I also like to make 3 points. Number one, I would say is be optimistic. And I thought, your presentation was very important and very powerful because people forget that in terms of human history, the human condition has never been better. I mean, global poverty is going to, as an absolute kind, is going to disappear by 2030. The global middle classes are going to grow from 1.8 billion in 2010 to 3.2 billion in 2020 to 4.9 billion in 2030. So more than half the world's population is going to enjoy middle-class living standards. And by every dimension, infant mortality, life expectancy, literacy, education, you name it. This is the best human condition ever. So if you don't accept this optimism, then you're not preparing yourself for this world. The second thing, of course, is that we are moving from a mono-civilizational world, which I spoke about, the 200 years of Western domination of world history, to a multi-civilizational world. So if you are only trained to think with the concepts and the language of one civilization, you're handicapping yourself. So for a start, the obvious thing to do, which fortunately I forced my children to do at the age of 6 and 8 and 10, learn Chinese. I'm Indian, my wife is an Irish American, our 3 children speak Chinese. It was an obvious thing to do in the 1980s. And it's actually been the best decision we made for our children. And then the third and final point, I think, is to also to build on what you said, is that I'm glad, as I said in my third point, technology is changing everything. And you actually proved it far more powerfully than anybody did. But in a sense, getting people to try and understand all these ramifications, because we've never had a planet where all 7 billion people can now directly connect with each other. It doesn't matter where you are, you can actually connect, right? Now that's going to change the human consciousness in a very profound way. Again, that's something we don't talk about. We talk about all the divisions, all the separations, but we don't talk about what I call the sort of the development of what I call, for the first time in human history, and I said this in my book, The Great Convergence, a new global civilization is emerging. So think about the new global civilization and how you deal with it.
I had to do some rapid adaptation. My points have been stolen.
Reinforcement isn't a bad thing, Evelyn. That's okay.
Yeah, I know.
It happens.
That's why I didn't want to speak last.
Let me add 3, I suppose. I think it would be understanding the human condition, which is an issue which doesn't change, I think, as Chris pointed out earlier. Literacy and biology. I think those would be the 3 things that I think are important. Understanding the human condition is my way of saying, I think we've got to equip our generations to come with an ability to take what they find in this increasingly complex world and to be able to make something of it, right? To access that optimism of how we push this whole, as Parag very nicely ended his presentation with, how we make the most of this so that we continue that trajectory, if we believe Parag, of, millennia of evolution towards sort of a better condition for humankind, as it were. One's got to be equipped to deal with the fundamental questions of, well, why are we here? What's it all for? Which are questions that are not really going to go away, whether AI takes over completely or not, essentially. So be it philosophy, Oriental and Occidental, etc., we've got to have those foundations still in our education, I think. Literacy is incredibly important and incredibly under-stressed. We think that it's okay to put across big ideas in a tweet. I think we're seeing with the current president of the United States that it's actually inadequate. And again, in an increasingly connected and complex world, the art of communication is going to be critical. And it's not going to be communicating in however many characters go into a tweet, I don't know. It's going to be, and it's got to have its foundation in what we old-fashionedly think of as literacy, because those are the foundational skills that allow you to branch off into how do we convey complex ideas in different forms. And biology, fundamentally, because in my own experience, that was the most important science that I learned in school. And it is the one science that teaches you about ideas about connectivity and evolution. And again, these, I think, are principles and themes that are not going to go away. Last semester, when I had to teach master's students the basics of the nutrient cycle, because they'd never come across it. How we would teach complexity to students who had never had any sort of understanding of the nutrient cycle. In other words, how things are connected and recycled across a system is beyond me, but there you are. So those would be my three.
So good on you for remembering the nutrient cycle. I long forgot that. Because I agree with everything that's been said, and we should definitely move quickly. I'll just add mobility. It hasn't been said yet, but because the global economic pie is growing, the geographic centers of opportunity are expanding and broadening. So, but that doesn't mean that you know where you should be, need to be at any given time, depending on where your career path is taking you. So, being mobile, being sort of not too wedded to one place. If you look at one of the reasons why one of the underlying reasons for the persistence of the negative effects of the financial crisis on American households is relatively low labor mobility. So if you were born and raised in some part of Michigan, you're just not that likely to ever want to leave it, even though very little has been done to resurrect that economic community, to take an extreme example. So being mobile, looking out for where the opportunities are and going there, being able to just get up and go. So that obviously can extend to digital mobility, right? Not just physical mobility, but look at all of the people, because I'm very conscious that 90% of the world population will still never leave the country in which they were born, but you can clearly see people changing their immediate circumstances by way of getting digitally connected, and therefore they're digitally mobile. They can be working, of course, for a different client or customer every single day, or 5 different customers in 5 different places in the same day, without ever changing their physical geography, but their digital mobility is there. So I think mobility is absolutely critical. Both of those probably require, again, a certain technological skill set. Again, I like to think of it as a language, right? So learn Mandarin, sure, but also learn how to code. Now, of course, a lot of people in even the technology field say, wait a minute, we now have AI that codes the code, right? That codes. So why would people know that? But of course, anyone who looks at the pay structures in Silicon Valley and elsewhere knows that product designers get paid more than programmers, right? So knowing how to code also means that you can, but having, let's say, a literature and arts or other background means that you can think about the customer as well as how to code for that customer. But that added layer of knowledge, but also the skill set involved to be able to manage programmers is critical. So I would say mobility, technology, and so forth.
Aaron, I know we're going to jump to questions in a minute, but I just want to jump on something that Evelyn said, which is communication. We've talked about this before, and I think that this is an issue that all of us have had, in that there are people, all of you in this room, You think big thoughts. You're highly educated. You wake up every day and you think about these massive trends. But how do we communicate this to the people where it matters? And I think this is very critical because I've gone to a lot of these conferences and I meet people with multiple PhDs and they're brilliant. And 60% of the time, I say, what? Oh, right, yes, very big trends, big thoughts, right.
Present
Good
company
good
accepted,
you.
of course.
Of course. Oh, no, you're all, wow, you're all Chris Rock. Anyway. And that might be okay in certain countries that have a permanent ruling class who do nothing but rule the country and let the peasants go on with their work. But in countries where the people, the populace, have a stake and a say in how their country is governed, how do we, who are trying to wrestle with these big ideas, communicate those ideas? What mediums, what languages do we use to try to communicate this to the people?
Particularly, I guess, Max, because we're dealing here with issues that are potentially quite unpalatable, right? That are difficult, that are black elephants, to go back to the theme of the whole conference. And when we know we are going to be pricking at the deep assumptions of systems, what kind of communication mechanisms become most useful?
And you see that certainly in elections in the United States, where too often we have debates between candidates where the candidate with the good ideas can't communicate, and the candidate who can communicate has no idea. Mm-hmm. So how do we change that?
Yeah.
One idea from all of you. Schroeder, we got to start with you.
Start with Kishore, yeah?
No, I was going to say, there's a danger of focusing on Donald Trump.
I didn't say Donald Trump.
But I think everyone in the room knew who you meant. I mean, you can either see him as an indicator of a new world that is coming, or as an exception. And my own gut feel is that Donald Trump is a sort of temporary interruption of history, that actually there are more optimistic signs of a world coming together. And here I want to point to two countries, Canada and France. Canada elected Justin Trudeau, France elected Macron. And I think that's, a sign that if you can put forward an optimistic message of the future, and you tell people that actually, especially people at the bottom, that you understand the mistake that was made in the previous era of globalization, what they call the Washington, D.C. consensus era, is that they forgot the people at the bottom. They saw the elites making a lot of money, everything is wonderful, but they forgot the growing inequality and people at the bottom being worse off. So if you get leaders who say, no, we have to take care of people at the bottom also, and also understand that there are positive features in life, and you come across with an optimistic message, I think you can win the game. And that's why I actually think my gut feel is that in the United States, in the next elections, you'll see a figure like Trudeau or Macron emerging that will capture the imagination. So it can be done.
Now, in all fairness, I'd like to just have a show of hands from the crowd. Those of you who are not American, can you say with any certainty that at some point in your life you've heard a very intelligent candidate or potential leader who was unable to communicate these ideas to the people? Show of hands. All right, so one or two. So the rest of you, all your leaders, can perfectly speak to the people. Great. So because the point I'm making is that you mentioned Donald Trump. This is not an isolated incident. This is global, this is human. That every country has had issues where the thinkers are not necessarily the best talkers. And that's why I'd like to ask
Let's
you
hear from another thinker then.
I mean, look, there are kind of two different conversations that one could have about this overall. One is how technology, and obviously I'm hopeful about technology, but one of the things that we've learned about technology in the context of this political elections and the global phenomenon you've talked about is that never in history have we been able to create the depth of the echo chambers that we can do now. So you could communicate as beautifully and simply as possible, But if you're only listening to the same people who think the way you think in Twitter and Facebook and so on, that's something that is a challenge which is relatively new. And again, there were always the yellow media, there was always ability to do that to some degree, but I think it has broader ramifications in the connected world that Parag describes so well. So that's one thing that we have to think about. But the other thing I will tell you is that these are very rich and complicated issues, but as it's been throughout history. I mean, Lend-Lease was a very complicated thing when you stop and think about it. But a president of the United States effectively looked at the people and said, if your neighbor's house on fire, you give them a fire hose. Perfect. And all of a sudden, an incredibly complex thing became something that people could begin to process in a powerful way. In my world, in the area of AI, people will talk about all the jobs that will be destroyed, and jobs may be destroyed. But you know what's very interesting is if you think about it, when technology came along, bank tellers were wiped out. There are still some bank tellers, and certainly around the world there are still bank tellers. But in America, bank tellers was really decimated and wiped out overall. So one way to look at that is doom and disaster. But another way, and it's a communication issue, is if you knew people who, for example, were incredibly numerate, were very precise in their work, were very data friendly, and very customer oriented, you'd say those are bank tellers, and you'd also say those are the 4 most important skills for the 21st century. So a lot of it also has to do with reframing of the way that we think about, not in a simplified binary way, but an emphasis on what kinds of powers are being uplifted that can become relevant in a growing and different world.
Evelyn, you're the one who brought up communication. What do you say? How can we do this?
I think it's a matter of scale. I agree with what the previous panelists have talked about. And that example of an early phase in the sort of mobile technology communication kept coming to my mind of how one of the most significant changes in Africa in terms of development with the advent of mobile phones was when, you know, women in rural villages in places like Kenya, Uganda, were given access to mobile phones, which then allowed them to communicate or act as intermediaries to communicate between producers and markets. I mean, you know, regional markets, I don't mean global markets, etc., which then shortened the unpredictable, or managed the unpredictability between bringing crops to market, etc. I mean, it sounds really mundane, but that was one of the most major, you know, steps forward in development work in Africa. And I just kept thinking, well, we would assume, you know, that introduction of new technology for rural women is a bit of difficulty. How do you communicate that, right? And how do you sort of, and some of it is about knowing your constituencies. Surely a huge part of that is that. So is your point about the people's skills, but in an applied format. In other words, in a world that is much more connected, there is also much more disaggregation and differentiation.
Yeah, so narrowcasting rather than broadcasting. Right?
Yes, absolutely. So that's got to go in parallel. There's got to be a much more fine-grained understanding of differentiated constituencies.
It's good communication. In a democracy, good communication cannot paper over bad policy for very long. So I know this question is about communication, but fundamentally it's also just about policy. There's good policy, and you can measure whether or not policy has a utilitarian benefit and whether or not, therefore, it's going to have a positive feedback loop in the democratic election or not. So you can communicate all you want, but fundamentally what you're communicating and the feedback you get is a judgment or a referendum on your policy. And so the problem is not just poor communication of what are essentially good ideas, because maybe they're not good ideas to begin with. And that's part of the problem. Now, you cannot overcome, now you also have a decline in the, let's say, the quality of the electorate, you might say, their level of education, the extent to which they're informed. You look at, people who voted for Brexit, and then that night at midnight, they're Googling what is the European Union, things like this. People who, don't understand the benefits of free trade and all these kinds of things. We're not going to fix that overnight. If you wanted to, and if you're honest with yourself, the only way to actually get people elected or get people educated, get voters educated in a large scale overnight is mandatory voting. Because if they don't have to vote at all, they're actually not going to vote. You have a declining rate, well over a 15 to 20% total decline in the last 30 to 40 years across Western democracies of voter turnout, right? So if people had to vote, as they do in this country, they're going to be a lot more knowledgeable about the basic issues because they actually have to go in there and tick a box, and they don't want to feel like total idiots when they go in there, and they want to know something about what they're talking about. So if you're really serious about having an educated, informed population with which you're actually communicating rather than just tweeting, there's a difference in communicating and tweeting as well, then you better just go for mandatory voting, because otherwise you're actually just fooling yourself.
These are the ideas that I was talking about.
Just on, because the mandatory voting I actually agree with quite strongly, and I think it's powerful, but the education part of it is essential. So as we know, it was reported quite well, the most Googled term in the UK the day after Brexit vote was, what is the EU?
Right.
So it's great to have people mandatory voting, but on the other hand, there's another element of this that has to be involved in terms of understanding and making the effort to understand what the issues are.
This is what I meant about ideas. The ideas don't necessarily mean communication ideas for the leaders themselves. It may be, what do you do about the electorate themselves so they can understand these ideas? So what do you think, Aaron? Open up the floor to questions?
I think we should hear from everyone else, because communication has to be two-way, right? And not
Exactly.
just us talking at all of you. Let's take 2 or 3 questions at a time if we can, so we cover as much ground as possible. Is that Lynn I see there? Right, a mic for Lynn Wells. Anyone else? The glare is pretty strong. Yes, let's go as well. We'll come to you after that.
I can't see them.
Lynn, go first.
So the question I have is about income inequality. And we've talked about the opportunities at the bottom from all the learning and the things can be done. But in fact, we're in a world where, I've forgotten the numbers exactly, but Davos is talking about some single or double-digit number of people having as much wealth as the bottom half of the planet put together. And so how do these trends, at what point does that move from being resigned to becoming pitchforks in the street, when you seriously get social unrest out of the inability to address social or income inequality?
Okay, hang on, let's take one more question. I saw a hand. I can't quite see faces because the glare is pretty strong, but we've got another hand here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Ricardo Borges from the European Commission in Brussels. Just a remark, that traveling from Europe for me just this first morning has been worthwhile. It was very, very interesting to see the world from a different perspective. And but I would like to comment to the question. Evelyn raised in her presentation this idea of collaborative black swans, and I know that we at IRAHSS we were looking more at risk and these sort of issues. But I'd like to ask the panel also if they could tell us what would be their sort of collaborative black swans. Can we look at the world that's sort of more also in the opportunity space, and what opportunities can we find in going forward in this new geopolitical landscape? Thank you.
Great. Well, why don't we start with that then? Inequality and collaborative black swans, and a more optimistic view on some things. Anybody want to get us going?
Well, on inequality, let me just take that one first. I think the question seems to be looking for a tipping point, when economic inequality bubbles over into political unrest. But it isn't just the sort of mere fact of inequality, right? It's the relative deprivation, it's the political circumstances, the sense that not only are there rich people versus poor people, but that there is this active exploitation, manipulation of the system, and that the perpetrators of that are proximate enough to take action against. So you can have your Occupy Wall Street movements, you can have anti-incumbent or anti-government movements in Greece. That's why governments have been falling left, right, and center in places like that. So you already see it happening. You may be looking for a hostile revolution or something like that. That's going to be the harder sort of phenomenon to predict, but that's just one of the broader, that's one species in the broader genus of political unrest emanating from kind of economic distortion. And so, what more does one need to look for than what is happening in the United States already, right? Because you have this this mismatch in the economic geography and political administration, and of course the sort of the political geography in terms of voting and gerrymandering and all of that kind of stuff. And you have a country being held hostage by a minority. That's really what populism is. We can take comfort in the fact that populism always fails. It's called Latin America. I think some of us are familiar with it, and many other places in the world. So, minority-led, single-issue-driven governments don't last very long. There was a part of me before Macron fortunately won that said, you know what? Let Le Pen win. It would be the best thing that happened because at least they'll just get her out of their system after about a year, and then you'll never hear from her again. Fortunately, they short-circuited that and leapfrogged that step. Part of it may have to do with the fact that Brexit came first, so they were able to see what a disaster it was. So be that as it may. But I think that we are going to live in a world of very high statistical inequality for a long time to come, in terms of the fact that domestic income inequality is now greater than international income inequality. There are some countries that are working hard to reduce that. Singapore is a small country. Some larger countries are trying as well. But by and large, it's going to be a baseline condition for a long time to come, in the way in which technology is progressing and capital markets remain the way they are, and that mobility of capital means that you're going to have core periphery dynamics at a very in a very unequal way in most countries for a very long time. So, therefore, the conditions are in place for the same kind of political upheavals to occur in many places.
Kishore, you had a thought on inequality.
I want to just respond to the question on collaborative Black Swan, because I think that's an excellent idea. I'm going to give one concrete idea, which is to take the European Union, which is the world's #1, the most successful regional organization, and take the second most successful regional organization in the world, ASEAN, and get them to collaborate with each other where they both learn lessons from each other. Let me give an example of where ASEAN can learn a lesson from EU and where EU can learn a lesson from ASEAN. If you look at the EU and ASEAN, the one big difference is that in EU, you don't just have within the European Union, you don't just have zero wars, you have zero prospect of war. There's zero chance that UK and France are going to go to war with each other, for example, or Germany and France. In ASEAN, we have achieved zero wars, but not yet zero prospect of war. In fact, Thailand and Cambodia almost had a skirmish a few years ago. So ASEAN can learn from the EU how you achieve zero prospect of war. Now, what can EU learn from ASEAN? The European Union is a mono-civilizational club, right? All the countries are Christian. By contrast, the most diverse regional organization in the world is ASEAN. Out of 600 million people, you have 240 million Muslims, 120 million Christians, 180 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and communists. It's the most diverse club in the world, right? Why doesn't the EU learn how to handle a multi-civilizational world from ASEAN? So this is a good example of how you can have collaborative black swans coming together, but it requires, and this is the hard part, because the West has been so dominant for so long, the idea that the West can learn lessons from the rest of the world doesn't occur to many Western leaders. So maybe the first thing that the West has got to do is, what can I learn from the rest of the world?
I wonder if we can push this a bit with the other panelists as well, because I'm taking a look at the Mentimeter ideas, right? And they are almost unmitigatingly negative, right? Trade war, fragmentation into spheres of dominance, war in Southeast Asia, Chinese Spring, right-wing Americans become terrorists, failure of official elites, major earthquake, tech shifts steal jobs. There's almost nothing here that's a positive black swan or a positive monumental change. So I think, Ricardo, that's a really powerful question, actually. And I want to see if we can maybe encourage the panel to see if there are indeed opportunities out there. Parag?
Throw in one more quick one, because it's already happening. It's just a question of scale, and that's clean technology transfer, right? I mean, the cost of solar power, storage and battery storage, all of these areas, we're seeing really remarkable improvements. We're seeing the cost of those technologies come down. We focus so much in our everyday discourse on the Paris Climate Agreement, which is non-binding and effectively, even pushes some of the necessary reforms and restraint into the future. Whereas right now we have all of the money and all of the technology to actually scale, sort of cleaner modernization processes into the countries that really need them. And I think that that's what we should be focusing a lot more attention on than just sort of diplomatic summitry.
Right. So your geotechnology point taken into the black swan room. Great. Evelyn?
Well, perhaps a more useful way to think about it may not be, whether something is negative or positive, right? Because, something that's cooperative has negative impacts on others as well. But I was rather thinking of new configurations that we weren't expecting, right? Let's think about this example, just coming off this, right? The fact that, again, let's stick with the United States, right? The fact that the Trump presidency has stepped away from the suite of global climate change agreements, right? But there are steps by individual states like California to step up and say, okay, we're going to keep to these agreements as one of the richest states in the United States. Suggests to me that there are new opportunities for new forms of configurations that may not be at a state-to-state level, for example, right? And we don't just think about subnational units. We think about transnational actors, corporations, pressure groups, our networks of regulators who are often non-state, sub-state, combinations of all sorts of things. That's the other element of the tuna world that we live in. And so new configurations, maybe we can think about that. Understanding that there will be, some of it will be good for some people and some of it will be bad for some people. Yeah.
Chris?
So here are 4 black swans that are worth thinking about overall, and I'm not saying they're positive or negative, you can decide overall. So we have a world of completely self-driving and electric cars or alternative energy cars, which completely revamps how we think about cities and eliminates 50% of carbon emissions. Here's a second one. Poverty is completely eliminated. Here's a third one. Disease is completely eradicated. Here's a fourth one. Because technology allows us, and the cost of doing this becomes so easy, and there are other technologies that allow us to do this, within 75 years we'll be able to colonize the moon and maybe the Mars within 75 years. Are those good or bad? But they're absolutely in our reach.
I want to endorse the poverty point. I mean, that's the point I made earlier.
You did.
You see the reduction and almost total elimination of absolute poverty is a remarkable transformation of the human condition, and future historians 50 years from now looking at our times and say, why were these guys so pessimistic when the world is getting better and better?
Yeah.
Can I continue?
Sure.
Cancer is completely wiped out
Yep.
in powerful ways.
Listening
I
to your
think we
disease
should be looking at. We are able to contain aging. I mean, I don't know if any of you have thought about this question. What's life going to be like for us all when we can live to 150? And I don't mean antiquated 150. I mean looking kind of like we do at 150. Right.
Aaron, I'll bring up one more example before we kick to the audience.
Yeah, let's do one more round after. Yeah.
I can tell you, as an American, I'm 45 years old, I witnessed the end of the Cold War, and I can tell you that my childhood was spent living under the threat of global thermonuclear annihilation. And it was a very real possibility. And it was something that we thought could very well happen. And I think the fact that somehow, for all our human foibles, that both sides managed to keep our fingers off the button, even in the darkest days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is a testament to humanity, that we made it through without blowing each other up. And I think this is something we need to teach to our children who didn't grow up in this time. I think is a testament to what humans can do when they are rational.
No, I think that's great. And having done many of these foresight processes, we all know that the easiest thing in the world is to come up with the negative scenario, right? The things we fear greatly. And it's a bit more challenging often to come up with the aspects that have more positive dimensions, even if they're not undyingly positive, as Evelyn pointed out. So I think this has been some very valuable input from the panel. Let's do another round of questions. I see a hand from Sheila, I think, right? Yes, so let's get a mic to Sheila. Anyone else? Whose hand I'm not seeing? Well, let's get the mic to Sheila first, and then we'll see if anyone else has a thought.
Wonderful conversation. I'm curious because I live in a world in the United States, though I spend so much time abroad, sometimes it's hard to believe that I am really an American citizen anymore. But so much of what we have talked about this morning is based on a world of rationality. But I am observing, both at home and abroad in many places, a world of irrationality and a world that makes no sense, or a Kim Jong-un who I do not trust. And I think there are issues that we need to discuss about what to do. We made it through the Cold War because there were two mega actors in that contest who basically were rational. We may be emerging into a world that has very little rationality in it, and a failing set of global institutions to deal with that irrationality. What are your visions of a future where we can deal with irrationality and perhaps either reconstitute new global institutions or reform our old ones?
Last call. There's plenty there to get us through a whole round of responses, actually, but I just want to see if anyone else has a question. Oh, we have one over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to add to maybe the point about the mention of how do you communicate to people who matter. I think something that hasn't really been touched upon that I'd like to know a little bit more about from the panelists is how do you engage youth? So, because that's the audience that we're talking about, right? Even if we're talking about geopolitics, they're the future that's going to be dealing with this. So how do you engage them, and what's the positive black elephant, so to speak, in this perspective?
Okay, great. So new global institutions, new vision, and how we engage young people.
Could I kick off on the rationality point?
Sure.
I often say this to my students. I don't know. I think there's a difference between irrationality and rationality that you don't like. I think that North Korea and Kim Jong-un particularly is absolutely rational. We just don't happen to quite like, and we happen to find quite dangerous his particular path of rationality. But he's rational in the sense that he's got an aim that he, broadly wants and means to get there. We're just not quite willing, the rest of the international community, to give him what he wants. That doesn't make him irrational. My take on rationality as a whole, comparing the Cold War to the post-Cold War period, is that during the Cold War we were less rational than we thought. And we know this in hindsight now from quite important releases of documents, etc., from important crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world did come much closer than we were aware of to nuclear Armageddon. And the current world is probably more rational than it may seem. So that's my 2 cents there, and Kishore's going to weigh.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, I also want to build on the point of rationality. Actually, one of the biggest changes in the world that has happened is what I call the march of reason. That human behavior globally is actually becoming more and more rational. Now, what's the proof of that? Quite simply, people are becoming educated. They have access to information. They make intelligent life choices about, for example, washing your hands. And guess what? You talk about the elimination of disease. A lot of it comes from washing hands. So it's the spread of soap. People's lives are being saved. So if you look at it, and one reason why the human condition is becoming better, by the way, is that the kind of information that was kept in the developed world is actually now spreading globally. And one simple indicator is things like clinics. Look at the number of clinics in the world. If you could just document it, the number has gone up like this. And in all kinds of remote corners of the world that never saw any kind of medical assistance, clinics are spreading. So as a result of that, that's why globally, by the way, one statistic that no one has mentioned, which is I think the most important statistic, is that the number of people dying in wars in the middle of the 20th century was somewhere up here, 500,000, millions. Now it's gone down dramatically, the number of people dying in wars. Now, why are wars becoming a sunset industry? Why, for example, has there been no major war in Southeast Asia, as I document in my book on ASEAN? Because the leaders now understand the cost of war, right? And they also understand they can make their society much better if they avoid the war option. And so if you look at it globally, in general, there are exceptions. There are areas of tension, there are problems, but overall, wars are becoming a sunset industry. So I can give you, in sector after sector, you can take education, you can take health, you can take management of interstate relations. There is a march of reason that is going up globally. And by the way, I also say, I'm actually trying to say in my next book that this is a Western gift to the world. Just as you've learned to organize your societies rationally, other societies are learning to organize themselves rationally and making rational decisions for their people, so the human condition is getting better. So on the case of rationality, I think we have an incredible amount to celebrate, and you should cheer up.
You know, I think
Chris and Parag both have thoughts. And if you can jump in on the youth communication issue, that would be handy.
Which
as
is
well.
where I want to go. Because
and Parag, was yours on
Global governance.
Let's finish global governance first and
Okay,
come
I'm
to
sorry,
youth
absolutely.
after that. Then. Yeah.
So on Sheila's point, so we all perhaps wish for stronger global institutions, but global institutions emerge and come into existence as a response to certain circumstances. My problem is that we think that we can jump to the global level and simply recreate, reform existing institutions or create new ones just sort of from scratch because we think they would be desirable. I think what's much more desirable is better local governance than better global governance. I'm much more interested in seeing our resources go towards well-ordered societies, to rebuilding Egypt, to figuring out the new political map of Syria and Iraq, and having functional, democratic, good governance with low corruption in those countries, than I am with apologies to Kishore, to reforming the UN Security Council, because, well, it hasn't happened, therefore it's not going to happen, as much as we would want it to happen. But should the fate of 1 billion people in Africa or the Middle East rest upon whether or not the UN Security Council can get its act together to ratify a peacekeeping mission? I would hope not. So local governance, and remember that we take transnational terrorism, for example, as evidence of some kind of global irrationality. But 99% of all terrorist attacks are local and domestic, and I think that's going to come up in the next couple of days in conversation. This is very well documented. Most of the world's terrorist attacks are in Nigeria, or in Pakistan, or in Iraq, or in Somalia, and various countries responding to domestic circumstances. There may be international variables, of course there are, involved in that terrorism, but let's not forget that whether it's Kashmir or Palestine, yes, there are, again, international ramifications, international sort of precursors, but these are domestic conflicts. So let's focus a lot more energy on local governance than we do on global governance, and then we won't have so much need for global diplomatic or political interventionism such as it is.
So, Chris, on
I think in some ways marrying the conversation about rational actors and youth, it never ceases to amaze me that in almost every poll that you ever read anywhere, certainly from America, but I see this in The Economist and globally as well, is it's never broken out by age. And so we get all these kind of general senses of where we think the world is going, where perception is, and when in point of fact it does break it down, two recent examples with the Brexit vote and actually the views on Palestine, you see a completely different view of the world from under 30 and over 45, for example. And so to pull on that string all the time I think is important. I'll take it a step further in the United States of America. You know that in America you're not allowed to do random polling on mobile phones. It's not allowed, it's illegal. So you've already said by definition that random polling isn't taking into consideration anybody under the age of 30. Yep. So we have to think about this. And what leads, I think, so powerfully to your question is that if you add what I touched on before, which are the demographics in most of the rising world that we've talked about today, are so heavily weighed towards people who are under the age of 30, that most of them have these tools of connectivity and capability with a much broader base from which they're looking at the world and the problems. And now they have the tools to solve those problems. I think in some respects, your question of all the things that make me hopeful, and I have to underscore so I don't seem too crazy here, there's plenty that worries me. But I think probably the thing that makes me most hopeful is what you just described. And in some respects, it's not so much about us in this room talking to youth. It is about youth talking to themselves and doing what they're doing. And eventually, I assure you, unless I'm right about living to 150, we'll get out of your way.
Great. I'm going to ask for the slides that I gave to the organizing team during the tea break, if that's all right. Could we put that up? Thanks. Max and I were chatting earlier on, and we were just trying to think of how to make sense of all the material that the four panelists had shared with us, and increasingly now from the floor here as well. And it struck us that a lot of the conversation was along what you see here as the horizontal axis. I mean, what's a good futures conference without at least one 2x2 matrix, right? So this is the first one. I'm sure there'll be more in the next couple of days. But we were really talking about the discrepancies between very functional major powers in and of themselves, and then, of course, the functional major power relationships between them. And then on the other end of that axis, you might have more dysfunctional kind of manifestations. But what we didn't hear as much about, I think, until towards the end of this Q&A, is this issue of what are the new actors in our systems, right? If we truly believe that we are in a polyarchic system, then who, apart from states, are important? And I think some of the new configurations that Evelyn mentioned, right? The idea of cities, of sub-regional, sub-national, sub-federal units starts to become important. And these might be very formal things like cities or provinces, but they might be very informal entities like epistemic communities. They might be individuals coming together as well. And I figured if we put these together, then we end up with some quite interesting scenarios that kind of draw on all the material that you've been sharing, and as well as with some of the questions. So if we can go to the next slide. You've got a very, very upper right hand that is what I like to call complex solutions for complex problems, because there's many hands on deck. They're trying to deal with the multiplicity of issues that we're facing. And this includes the kind of infrastructure problems that Parag mentioned, but also you're dealing with convergence of great power interests, a world order that is fairly polycentric. It includes businesses like NAFAM and SOOC, that Chris spoke to us about. And it's fairly vital and emergent as an ecosystem. But then if you kind of move to the top left corner, I've called that one subbed in, because that's really all your sub-units starting to become much more prevalent, right? Cities and provinces being more active on climate change, Chris's new global entities becoming major players in talent and people management, and states kind of being much less active in this kind of realm, because either because they're mired by poor leadership or because there are internal protests, and we find that states have fairly thin functions. They're not irrelevant, but they are more or less restricted to delivering of local welfare and social support systems, and maybe a little bit of defense and security, but not much else. Bottom right, combination of functional major powers and passive new actors. I call that New Westphalia, right? So you might have a system there where you have strong functional states, like the France Macron and the Canada Trudeau model, maybe models like the US and the UK coming through a process of recovery that Kishore mentioned, and a pragmatic China. But here you have businesses and communities and cities not really able to deliver very much beyond the basics of the functions that they were born with. Right, so we have a system here where the new actors are not particularly active. And then finally, bottom left scenario of modern medievalism, where really nothing works or doesn't work very well, right? Major powers aren't figuring very much here, but the vacuum is not being filled by new actors either. And you've got really local pockets of functional communities. And maybe this isn't such a bad world, because as Parag said, he'd rather have local communities be very functional than try and fix large overarching systems that end up not having huge amounts of effects on us. And I thought it'd be nice in the last 5 minutes or so if we could end with just any reactions that the panel has on this. This is very much quick and dirty, right? It's not the result of any long and drawn process of foresight research. It's just about synthesizing the material that we have so far, and hopefully helping us think a little bit beyond the concept of the nation state, because I think geopolitics is going to involve a lot more new actors as well. Parag?
One of the issues with this is that I think it's a really good start, but you're not distinguishing between sort of positive and negative actors, right? So an active new actor, is it Bill Gates or is it Bin Laden, right? And so their impact is, so you wouldn't consider Bin Laden as an active new actor combined with the fact that you do have functional major powers to therefore mean a complex solution for a complex problem. Yep. So you're referring here, generally speaking, to positively inclined actors, but that's not. This whole literature on non-state actors, generally speaking, doesn't do a good enough job really in differentiating the effects that they have, or quantifying. Is there more sort of positive non-state actors or less time? So the reality, of course, is a combination of all of these things. One of the problems when we talk about New Westphalia or modern medievalism very often these days is that in this debate about the future of the state, which I've been far too insinuated in for the last 20 years, is that people think that there's one kind of state, or that the one kind of state that we have in Europe is any resemblance to the kinds of states that there are around the world. There is no one state. There has never been. Even by using the word Westphalia, by the way, just as a reminder, everyone, this 17th century fiction, as all of us who are in IR theory, increasingly, go back and revise and rethink. Because don't forget that even in the Westphalian era, and since the birth of the Westphalian era, we've lived in a colonial and imperial world. So there was no sovereign legal equality among states since until at the absolute earliest, 1945, which is very, very recently. And even since then, you cannot truthfully say, because since 1945 to today, the number of countries in the world has quadrupled. So you have 3/4 of the world being comprised of post-colonial and post-Soviet countries. I would not say that Tajikistan and America are the same kind of state. At least I hope they're not. So you've got 200 very, very different kinds of states. So it's very clear that we live in a completely medieval, multi-level, heterogeneous system. Westphalia as a principle or in practice applies to some of that world, but certainly not all of it. And whether or not you have positive or negative non-state actors operating in those different regional domains is such a diverse answer that it's almost impossible to come up with a meaningful global generalization.
Great.
But isn't that the meaningful global generalization in itself?
Yes, I'm comfortable with that, but most people don't seem to be.
I'm okay with that as well.
And you want to add on? I mean, Evelyn's doing a lot of work now on complex systems as well, right? And getting IR theory and complex systems work to interact. Any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with what Parag has said. I think that the real world is a composite of these things. It depends on the issue area you may be looking in, depends on the geographical location you may be looking in, it depends on the configuration you're looking in. And I think, again, as a mark of what skills we need to operate in this world, it is that degree of comfort with understanding that it's not a dichotomous world, and it is going to be like this. Looking at that diagram, I guess I am more persuaded that we live already in a world where there are active new actors rather than passive ones. So I'm on the top half of that quadrant in that sense. It seems to me when we think about the positive and negative types of active new actors, what we may be driving towards is a system in which there is a competition for reaching out to the forgotten communities, ideals, peoples. Some of the conversation has been about income inequalities, youth, reaching out to youth and others. But if you think about the crises we've had over the last most recent decades, so much of these have been about the lost, the unheard, different sorts of communities, be it terrorism or other sorts of issues, Seattle, in the beginning of the protests against globalization and so on and so forth. So really what the active new actors are about are different ways of appealing to these subaltern communities, if you like. And for how long they remain subaltern, of course, is the issue. And that's where I think those deep, quiet trends that Peter Ho began the conference about, maybe that's where we need to look in different guises.
Evelyn, I want to just jump on that quickly because I think that this is a theme that we've seen in every speaker, and I think we're going to see until the end, till we all go home, which is change can be very positive, but it can also leave people behind. And we see that. We see that with Brexit. We see that with Trump. We see the people who wake up one morning and their skill set, their place in the world is gone. They're obsolete. They don't know how they fit in. They're disenfranchised by change. Barack Obama wrote about an audacity of hope that when he was a community organizer, his biggest enemy were the black pastors who were benefiting from the status quo. You hear it from our soldiers in Afghanistan who think that building a well in an Afghan village is a good thing. Somebody is going to be left behind by that well. So I think when we discuss change, this is not an answer we all should have right now, but we should all think about this, is when these huge change comes in, no matter how positive they are, there's going to be people left behind. And how do we make sure that these people who are forgotten don't turn to desperation and violence as they are left behind by the rest of us?
I suspect that'll be a major theme this afternoon as well when we talk about the future of technology.
But
Kishore, you have a thought, please.
Yeah, I was going to say one way of trying to figure out how dysfunctional or functional the world is going to become is by looking at the most important geopolitical relationship in the world today, which is that within the world's number one power, United States, and the world's number one emerging power, which is China. And you can see both the dysfunctional and functional elements in both. The dysfunctional element is that it's a zero-sum game. I guarantee you that China will continue to protest when a US naval vessel sails within 12 miles of some South China Sea reef. It's going to happen. And I guarantee you that when China launches a new initiative like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the United States Treasury calls Asian capitals and say, don't join the AIIB, dysfunctional. And you have the functional. Why is China succeeding? Because American universities take in 170,000 Chinese students to study in American universities. This is a huge gift from America to China. And when China is trying to transform its university system, President Rick Levin of Yale at the time invites the top university presidents in China and says, come to Yale and I'll show you how a new university is run. So you look at so many of the functional aspects, new functional aspects of China, they were gifts from America to China, to its #1 competitor. So this is an example of how you live in a complex world where you see the dysfunctional elements and the functional elements living together.
Chris,
Three very
the last word.
Yes, and three very quick ones. One, I could not agree with you more, and I hope more time is spent on this issue, because I think a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley thinks everything will kind of work itself out. We've seen it in the 80s with steel. We've seen it recently with NAFTA, and I'm a huge fan of NAFTA, net. But the ramifications of it and thinking that it'll just work itself out, I think, is bad. And we have new tools, again, today by which we can help folks like this, and I hope that really does come to bear. Second is a very quick caution. I think this chart is very provocative. I always get a little bit anxious when we use words like medievalism and Westphalia, because I think a lot of us like to drive somewhat by analogy. And I think what is happening today is so profoundly different that we have to be careful about what we've done before. I get called in for reasons I don't fully fathom to talk about technology and cyber and the national security parts of Washington from time to time. And I know that when I'm sitting with someone who says, what we need right now to deal with non-state actors, what we need right now is to have a START treaty for cyber, I realize that they simply do not understand at all what's happening both technologically and in terms of the interactions, which leads to my last comment about the new actors. And the downside of new actors, which are very profound, which we're seeing right now in the hacking situation, is something very profound is being unleashed in a very negative way. And obviously understanding those dynamics, how they interact with nation states that we do understand, but how much I think will progressively come from those actors, from their own motivation in and of themselves is powerful. But having said that, to wrap up in a hopeful sense, it has stunned me as I've traveled all over the world and I've spent time with the new generation she alluded to, and particularly about entrepreneurs, how they are a lingua franca. I can sit with entrepreneurs in India and in France and in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East and whatever, and I get them in a room and they're the same people. They're brainstorming the same way, they're problem solving in the same way, they have the tenacity of trying to make something that was never there before in the same way. And I think that also is a new non-state actors. We tend to think of non-state actors as the negative hacking types, but I think there's another kind of non-state actors in the new generation that we should take very seriously.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great note on which to end. I know at least one of our panel has a plane to catch, so we need to end now.
Yes.
And so thank you very much, all four of you. And
thank you, everybody.
Max, thanks for co-hosting.
Thank you. That was good.
That was good.